earlier. Now, the Arizona athletic director, here are John Willner with the story. There is the story about Robert Robbins from Arizona. Here are some of the quotes from that story, and Paul and Craig interject along the way. Asked about discussions between Arizona and the Big 12, Robbins didn't answer directly, but said he has friends in the conference and was in favor. This is not the current Big 12 stuff. From the remaining Big 12 schools after Texas and Oklahoma announced they were joining the SEC, I personally like the idea of forming the Pac-20 or the Big Pac, whatever you'd want to call it. I thought it would have been really cool, but it got very complicated.
It didn't actually get that complicated. USC and UCLA were leaving and didn't want to commit to that conference.
Because they knew they were leaving even a year before that, right?
Yeah, so even if, I mean, I'm sure there's complications past that, you know, Stanford and Cal and their kind of, you know, search for like academic institutions and, you know, politics and blah, 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 and money split and yada, yada, yada. I think ultimately it came down to the fact that USC was probably never going to say, yeah, let's do it, because they had one foot out the door. Well, if not almost both feet out the door, and just weren't saying it yet.
All right. I would love to be closer to the Big Ten or SEC, but being closer to the Big 12 is more realistic. Robbins saying the Kliavkoff, the Pac-12 commissioner, has done a great job working on the media deal, and I think he'll bring us something that's good enough. What is good enough? Asked about the speculation over the future of the conference, Robbins went on to say rejected the notion that schools, including Arizona, would bolt for the Big 12 prior to being presented with the media rights proposal. It's heavily dependent on Kliavkoff and his team negotiating a good media deal for us to stay competitive.
Well, I mean, I bet this was a tough quote for some people who are really trying to go a certain way with this, because as soon as you feel like the door's absolutely positively shut on everything and anything, it's like, as long as the media deal is competitive. So, you know, if you want to really dig into these words and read them at face value, then that's one that's not exactly like, oh, yeah, nothing could ever break us apart. We'll never, ever break these bonds of the Pac-12. That's absolutely saying, like, the offer's not great and it's bad enough that it would be worth moving, then, yeah, we would explore that. That's basically what he just said, unless I'm wrong in reading that. Did you guys read that same way?
Put that back one up,
okay.
Garrett.
Yeah.
Put that one up again at the bottom. It's heavily dependent on Commissioner Kliavkoff and his team negotiating a good media deal for us to stay competitive.
So if you'll leave that there, Garrett. So I realize, and again, I'll say this hopefully for what's the final time now. I've been Pac-12 stays together this entire time. The entire time we've been doing this. I've never even crossed the line of feeling like the Big 12 was going to be adding Pac schools, but it's been fun to see all the conversation. Not so fun to see some of the others that have made it just really weird and personal. But I think that's part of their own little PR campaigns. But regardless of where you sit on this, even the pro-Pac folks have to say, like, that's a quote there that kind of like cracks the door just a little bit. Now, you probably feel like it's not going to matter because the deal's going to be competitive. But to say that there's nothing to anything, and there are folks who certainly acknowledge, like, different levels of, like, they have talked, but it's never gotten serious. They've talked and it's gotten serious. There's some that still claim they haven't talked at all, which those folks are obviously not being entirely truthful. And there's some that say that there's no chance to anything could possibly ever happen. That quote flies in the face of that, because that says if the TV deal sucks, then there's a window.
I think you can look at it. It depends on what you want. I think you can look at that quote and say, okay, done. It's over. It's just a matter of them announcing the new media deal and then moving on, and then they decide whatever they want to do with the Pac-12. Or you can look at that as if there is a little bit of a light in that door, as you mentioned, Craig, is cracked.
I think the light in the door is not for now. I think the light in the door is to see what happens over the next 5 years in college football overall, but with the Pac-12, because one of the terms he used in the previous quote was good enough. Good enough is, you know, that's a loaded term. Like, good enough can mean, like, okay, it's good enough, we're fine now, or it's good enough for now. I mean, like, there's a lot of ways that can be. That's what ground the Pac-12 has to tread on right now, is good enough. If you asked, I mean, obviously the Big Ten and the SEC, if you asked what kind of ground they're on, they're like, it's great. Everything's wonderful here. Look at the soil. It's wonderful.
Beautiful. It's
beautiful.
fertile.
Everything's great. And the Big 12 would say, we're pretty good. We like where we are. The ACC is like, well, we don't really know, but we're going to live here for another decade. And then the Pac-12 is like, well, I guess it's good enough.
Yeah. I mean, I just think that that's a super obvious quote. They didn't even, it says there was no chance of bolting prior to a proposal being put out there. Well, duh. I know that they had to include that for reasons, but yeah, I don't think anybody, no matter what you predicted that the Pac-12 would see a school leave before even seeing the offer.
If a school left before the offer was placed on the table,
makes no sense. Yeah.
The guy, whoever makes that decision, would be
fired. Yeah, that's bad business. So, that's what he's saying is, nobody was going to leave before an offer was proposed. So, yeah, I don't think anybody expected anybody would leave prior to knowing what the money situation would be. That's how I read that. But also, very much, and again, I think one of the more grounded ones, and I think y'all are as well. We haven't really got caught up in this is really going to happen, but it's certainly been interesting.
We've covered it.
Yeah, we talked about it. We covered the what ifs, ands, buts, all that kind of stuff, but we've never been this is happening. And so I think that, again, there's a lot of different ways you can read that, but I read that as, we weren't going to explore something without seeing a TV deal first, but he also didn't say that oh, no, there's absolutely no chance that would happen regardless. So again, that's one that leaves it open to interpretation.
Couple of more. And again, we're also going to have a quote or two from the president, the Arizona State president. This is from Robbins. He painted a nuanced picture for Arizona, citing the school's proximity to the Big 12 footprint and that the league's powerhouse basketball brand as the basis for some affinities. Of course, if you look at the Big 12 with what they have, especially with the tradition of Kansas and Baylor winning the last 2 national titles, Arizona's history, hell, one of those 3 might win it again this year. Probably, if you put it in order, it might be like Arizona, Kansas, Baylor, and Baylor would be on the outside looking in as far as the odds. And then who knows what else, with Texas being as red hot as they are, but some affinities.
Yeah, affinities for sure.
So is that still looks pretty good to me, and I may want to date it?
I think that's probably also the fan base, though,
sure.
too. That's when you have people like Jason Shear talking, I mean, he hears from the fan base more than most, right? Because he works for a site that is populated by Arizona fans. That's who goes to it for the most part. Some other people might randomly, but he's writing and covering and talking to Arizona fans. So when you hear what Arizona fans want, I think there's a large majority of them that just want the dance to end. And that means, moving to another league that would be more permanent because, good enough for, whatever ground they're on. So that's where it's going. Now, there's one, I think it was in the tweet, Garrett, that Robbins said as well, and we haven't gotten to this, but on the Pac-12 media rights and Big 12 rumors, why would you move for a couple $1 million a year more? He also asked that. Okay, let's dial that back. There were a lot of people convinced that the Pac-12 was going to get more for sure.
Well, the commissioner said they would.
Well, if he's saying why would you move for a couple $1 million more, then
is that insinuating they know it may be $28 million or $29 million rather than 31 with the football?
Exactly. So he's kind of insinuating that maybe the Pac-12 deal will be less. So another thing that just
not enough to where you would have movement.
Yeah.
If we really quoted people directly on this, there's a lot of people you see talking out of every side of their mouth with this, because the same person who said they'll never move, there's been no discussions, is, well, of course there's been discussions. I didn't, and then it turns into that, and then the Pac-12 is going to get a higher number is now turned into, no, I just said it was going to be a closer, I think I've seen a lot of that going on today.
For a couple of $1 million less.
Yeah, or I've seen quite a bit of that actually. But I think that it kind of depends on who you look at, because a lot of people have said a lot of different things. And there are some people who said it's not going to be more, it's going to be close. And there are some who said it's going to be more. And there are some who said it's going to be way less. And so whoever said it's going to be less but not enough to make them move, that looks, if you base it off of his quote alone, that looks like what it's going to be. And I think that was probably the most logical expectation through all of this, because we talked about the Pac, how could you have a much higher deal, because there were even some that thought that they'd comfortably surpass. There was a quote just like a week ago of we'll comfortably be past.
It's a layup.
Yeah, it's the layup quote. It's a layup that will have a better deal than the Big 12 or whatever the exact quote was. It was something in that regard, but yeah.
Here's one of the mistakes that led to months of this back and forth when Kleofkoff on record basically said, I think we'll be near $50 million. Isn't that Paul and Craig when he came out? Because, and again, they were being, at least, basically, depending on who you ask, there were vultures, right? I mean, that's kind of the term, or just the fact that the Big 12 got theirs done, where the Big 12 may have given up money for exposure, the Pac-12 could get less money, and they're not going to get better
less exposure.
Yeah. So,
the only $50 million
again is debatable.
The only $50 million I know is from the Pac-12 network, a little scandal that we touched on briefly. Where I
thought there was a quote from Kleofkoff at some point, Craig and Paul, that he said that he felt like they could reach almost the $50 million range. And that may have created some of the speculation. And oh my God, there's no way they're going to get to that number.
The Big 12, expected to see 15. See, like this article's not quite.
Okay, well that's fine.
Yeah,
there's another quote we got to get to as well.
Yeah, it's.
Robbins from Arizona framed the future of the Pac-12 as a business decision with the onus on the commissioner to craft a competitive media rights deal.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's what it has to be. And so if they, it's how it's been the whole time. It's nice to hear. I mean, it is good to hear from these university presidents who have been fairly mum on the subject overall. And I get you're in negotiations, but to hear from them and say, like, no, we don't want to leave. No one wants to leave. Now, granted, that could change, in a heartbeat if they come back and the deal's not what they think. But, I don't expect that to happen in this go-around. But yeah.
I just received it. Go ahead, Craig. I just received the text, and I'm waiting. Let me wait to see who this is about media rights and all that. I'm going to quote the text because a lot of people are contacting us, of course, who have been a part of these things before.
Yeah, so, I mean, they've apparently got a deal, but they're still working on the deal. Is that how I'm reading this? We're waiting on the final analysis and the final numbers, I suppose, because it's talking as though it's done, but then not quite done, but competitive enough that they know enough to know that it's not going to cause the conference to fall apart, which is kind of what a lot of people expected was you may not have as much money as the Big 12, but, again, it's not going to be far enough off to make enough of a difference to cause schools to leave. And that seems to be where we are. So, I do think that the final numbers should be awfully close. I don't know, like, if there's going to be a victory lap for whoever has, like, $1 more than the other when all is said and done. It sounds like they might be a couple million shorter, but, again, in the grand scheme of things, that's not enough to make waves. So, I mean, they're saying the right things, and there's been little, comments along the way that have been in the same arena. So it's really just been, a guessing game as to how long this could continue to take. And, of course, the longer it takes, the more that you wonder. And that's what it's led to. So now to hear, two Arizona officials on the record on the same day and speaking a little further about it, a little more in depth about it is, I'm sure very reassuring for Pac-12 fans and enlightening for everybody else. And, it sounds like they're going to be close, like I said. So, yeah, now we await these final numbers and what that's going to look like.
All right. Now, the Arizona president, Michael Crow, also in an article with Piper Hansen and Alex Wakefield. Here's a quote from him. Paul, you also got this one. You were the one that got. All right. There have been no discussions with the Big 12 Conference on moving, Crow said. I mean, there's been discussions between everyone everywhere on all things related to where our conference is going and where stuff's going to end up and what's happening. We are committed to the Pac-12. Now, when he says discussions between everyone everywhere, I would think he's referring to all of the teams within the Pac-12, all the programs and universities, or is he outside, maybe even outside of that box?
I think that he has... I'm sure that they've had to have broached the topic because if they don't, like, if none of these universities were sitting waiting for the possibility of this media deal to be a dud, a total dud, then they're crazy, right? They're absolutely nuts to not think of it in like what's the doomsday scenario. So yeah, I think he's had discussions about. I think he's copping to having discussions about what the next move is for the Pac-12 or for their individual institution. But I don't think there's been anything formal where, Brett Yormark and the powers that be have sat down all together and said, okay, here's when it would happen. Here's what would have to happen. I think that's something that's not to that phase yet because they don't know what their TV deal is. And if their TV deal is bad, then I would say that stuff would get ratcheted up, but they don't clearly expect it to be.
All right, here's one other quote, Craig, and then you, again, respond to it. We're close to knowing where, this is President Crow, Arizona State. We're close to knowing where we're going to be, and I think we're close to a deal. I think that the Pac-12 media rights became more complicated with the departure of USC and UCLA. Of course, they absolutely did. The media rights became more complicated also, as things always do, because markets go like this. They're up and down, up and down. But we have fabulous sports teams, and the remaining teams, we're going to get a good offer. We're in the final stages of that process.
Yeah. So, again, they are closing in on a deal, and it sounds like they're going to be content with it. I think the discussions thing is another one. I'll go back to the very beginning of, this person said this person said that, and kind of it depends on where you look on what actually is being said. But there are absolutely folks who said there's zero discussions taking place, absolutely none whatsoever. And that would seem to indicate otherwise. Now, not to the extent of they're on the way and the invite's been sent and people like that who have said the extreme opposite of that. I think it's, somewhere in the middle. And maybe he hasn't, but somebody who knows somebody who's, whatever's had a small 5-minute conversation and maybe you could report that as, conversation. But, there clearly has been some level of preliminary discussion about just the state of things in general. I don't think that comes as much of a surprise, but how in-depth it ever got, it doesn't appear like it was anything but just shallow conversation, if anything. But, they're going to be close. It sounds like it's around the corner. I think they've definitely flipped the PR or whatever angle that people want to use, the narrative, whatever that might be, however you would describe it, because all we've heard is from the Pac-12 over the last week or so. And now you've had, the Arizona State Presidents now talked a couple of times.
Utah late last week.
I think I'm going to have Utah. Yeah, Utah late last week. Now the Arizona schools both on the same day, or at least we're hearing it on the same day. And I know there's been other comments along the way, but this is for sure the most at length they've gone on the topic and the most assured they've been as far as the level of commitment and just being broader about the subject and reinforcing their expectations, because there's been little comments here and there, and you see what happens if somebody takes that comment and then takes a knife to it and dissects it, and it's like, well, this one sentence blurb here means, and what about, and we get into that part of it, whereas I think that the more that they're talking today and the fact that you have a couple of voices, it's really, like I said, reinforcing kind of where they are, which is good if you're a Pac-12 person.
I'm going to read this text because this